I cannot say with certainty how long we had been underground. Time, much like the geography of that cursed autumn, had dissolved into a thick gray slurry. In my memory, the ceiling of that dugout is always just 3 inches above my helmet, a jagged maw of roots and weeping clay ready to swallow us whole. I remember the smell most of all. It was not the smell of death that came later, sweet and cloying, but the smell of living men rotting by inches. Wet wool, unwashed skin, the acrid bite of cheap tobacco, and the underlying metallic tang of terror. They called me a medic. They put a bag of rolled gauze and morphine syrettes in my hands because I had steady fingers, the kind that could skin a sable without nicking the pelt. But sitting in that hole, knees pulled to my chest, I was no soldier. I was a trapper from the north, a creature of the open taiga, and I was drowning in the earth. Back home in the Arkhangelsk Oblast, the world had no ceiling. The sky was a vast, pale dome that stretched from the white horizon to the stars. I would spend weeks on my skis, gliding through silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. The air there was sharp, tasting of pine needles and frost. It claimed you. But here on the banks of the Dnieper, the air was heavy. It sat on your chest. It tasted of sulfur and the wet, black mud that coated everything, filling our boots, our fingernails, our mouths. I closed my eyes and tried to summon the image of the tree line back home, the way the birch trees looked like bone against the snow. Instead, the ground shuddered. Dust trickled down the back of my neck. The bombardment had started again. It wasn't a sound you heard with your ears so much as a pressure you felt in your teeth. The German artillery was walking the line, searching for us. With every impact, the timber supports of our dugout groaned. I stared at the log directly above my head. It was splintered, bowing inward under the weight of the soil. My chest tightened, a familiar panic clawing at my throat. It wasn't the shrapnel I feared. It was the burial. The idea of this small, dark box collapsing, pinning me in the dark where I couldn't draw breath. A boy next to me, Grigory, I think his name was, a farm kid from the Urals, was muttering something, rocking back and forth. He was clutching his rifle so hard his knuckles were white. I wanted to tell him to stop, that his movement was using up the air. But my tongue felt swollen and useless. In the taiga, when a storm comes, you dig a shelter, but you leave a hole for the smoke, a hole for the sky. You are never sealed in. Here we were already in our graves. We were just waiting for the dirt to be filled in. The barrage intensified. The world outside ceased to exist, replaced by a rhythmic, hammering violence that shook the lice from our uniforms. The oil lamp flickered and died, plunging us into absolute blackness. That was the worst of it. The dark. In the forest, night is never truly dark. There is starlight on the snow, the reflection of the moon. There is depth. Here, the darkness was solid. It pressed against my eyeballs. I could hear the other men breathing, ragged, shallow gasps. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the cold, wet wall of the trench. It was slimy. I pulled my hand back as if I had touched a corpse. I started to pray. Not to God I had left him back in the village church, but to the earth itself. It was a coward's prayer. I knew that. I should have been praying for victory, for the motherland, for the destruction of the fascists who had burned our villages. But in that suffocating dark, patriotism was a distant concept. There was only the crushing weight of the soil and the desperate need to expand my lungs. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the hammering stopped. The silence that followed was ringing, painful. I fumbled for my lighter, the flint sparking twice before a small, yellow flame pushed back the shadows. The faces of the men around me were masks of soot and sweat, eyes wide, staring at nothing. A rat fat on the spoils of the front, scuttled over Grigory's boot. He didn't even flinch. The heavy canvas flap at the entrance was thrown back. Gray light spilled in, hurting our eyes. Volkov, get your kit. It was Lieutenant Smirnov. He looked like a ghost, his face gray with dust, a bandage wrapped around his left hand. He didn't come in. He stood in the doorway, bringing a draft of cold, fresh air that I drank in greedily. Is it over? Someone asked from the corner. For now, Smirnov said. His voice was flat, stripped of emotion. He looked at me, then at the others. The fourth guards are moving up. We have the order. My stomach turned over. I knew what was coming. We all did. We had been staring at the river maps for weeks. We crossed the river at 400. Smirnov said. He let the flap fall, sealing us back in. For a moment, nobody moved. The Dnieper. The Germans had fortified the West Bank for months. It was a suicide run. To cross that water was to walk naked into a fire. I looked at my hands. They were shaking. I forced them to stop, clenching them into fists. I should have been terrified of the machine guns, of the mortars that would churn the water into a bloody froth. And I was. But as I grabbed my medical bag, checking the straps, I felt a strange, perverse relief. We were leaving the hole. We were going out into the chaos, yes, but it was open air. I would rather bleed out under the stars than suffocate in this mud. I crawled toward the exit, dragging my pack. The fear was there, a cold stone in my gut, but the hunter in me was waking up. The waiting was the trap. The movement was life. We are exposed. We are in the open field. There is no cover. Then the sky tore open. It didn't start with a sound, but with light. A flare popped overhead, hanging in the air like a dying sun, bathing the river in a stark, magnesium-white glare. We were illuminated. Every boat, every helmet, every terrified face was suddenly visible, naked against the black water. Down, get down, the silence shattered. The West Bank erupted. It wasn't like the movies. It wasn't a steady rattle. It was a continuous, tearing sheet of noise. The German MG-42s, the bone saws, opened up, their tracers skipping off the water like angry hornets. The air around us snapped and hissed. The man rowing our boat jerked violently, his head snapping back, and collapsed over the oars. The boat slewed sideways, broadside to the current. "Grab the oars," I screamed, but my voice was lost in the roar. Water geysered up around us as mortar shells began to walk across the river. The boat next to us vanished in a flash of orange and red, showering us with splinters and wet, heavy debris that I tried not to identify. A hand grabbed my shoulder. It was the radio operator. He was mouthing something, his eyes wide with shock. Then he slumped forward, clutching his throat. Blood, dark and arterial, spurted between his fingers, spraying over my medical bag. The fear vanished. The claustrophobia, the dread, it all evaporated. There was only the work. The problem, the blood. I grabbed him by the tunic and hauled him to the bottom of the boat, ignoring the water sloshing around our ankles. The boat was spinning now, drifting helplessly in the kill zone. Bullets punched through the wood hull, thwack, 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 missing my head by inches. I didn't flinch. I was a mechanic of flesh now. I ripped his collar open. The wound was jagged, bubbling. I jammed a pad of gauze into the hole, pressing down with all my weight. He thrashed, his boots kicking against the ribs of the boat. "Hold still," I roared, leaning over him to shield his body with mine. I could feel the heat of the tracers passing overhead. We hit something hard, sand. The jolt threw me forward. Out, everybody out, we were grounded. The West Bank. I dragged the radio operator over the gunwale, falling into the waist-deep water. It was freezing, shocking the air from my lungs. I hauled him through the mud, his radio bouncing behind us, the wire tangling in my legs. The beach was a slaughterhouse. Men were screaming, crawling, dying in the sand. We scrambled up the embankment, clawing at the roots, slipping in the mud. The machine gun fire was cutting the grass just inches above our heads. We rolled into a shallow depression, a bomb crater, tumbling over each other in a heap of wet limbs and gear. I checked the radio operator. He was pale, his eyes rolling back, but the bleeding had slowed. He was alive. I looked around. We had made it. We were on the West Bank, but we were pinned. The German positions were dug into the high ground, raining fire down on us. We couldn't move forward. We couldn't go back. The roar of battle was deafening. Mortars, grenades, the screams of the wounded calling for mothers who couldn't hear them. The air was thick with smoke and the copper smell of blood. Suddenly, a figure stumbled over the lip of our crater and collapsed. It was a runner, his uniform torn, his face a mask of blood and dirt. He was gasping for air, his chest heaving. He looked at the lieutenant, who had crawled in beside me. "Second platoon," the runner choked out, pointing back the way he had come. "Toward the north. They pushed into the trees." He coughed, spitting red phlegm. "We lost contact. They're cut off. The whole squad. Gone." I looked where he was pointing. Beyond the ridge, a dense, black forest loomed against the burning sky. The trees were tall, ancient pines, their branches interlaced like the fingers of a miser. It looked just like the forests of home, the forests where I had felt safe, the forests where I was the master. But as I stared at that dark, impenetrable wall of wood, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the river water soaking my clothes. The forest wasn't empty. It was alive with muzzle flashes. It wasn't a sanctuary anymore. It was a mouth, and it had just swallowed our men. The runner grabbed my arm, his grip desperate. "They're alive." I heard them screaming in there. I looked at the trees again. The silence of the woods was gone, replaced by the hungry roar of war. And I knew, with a sinking dread, that I would have to go in. I left my rifle in the mud. A medic cannot carry death if he intends to carry life. I took only my satchel and a knife, slipping over the rim of the crater and vanishing into the tree line. The transition was instant. One moment the sky was a bruised purple bruise of artillery smoke. The next I was swallowed by the black throat of the pines. In Arkhangelsk, the forest was my mother. She taught me to walk without breaking a twig, to smell the turn of the weather, to listen to the silence. But this forest was a stranger. It did not smell of resin and thaw. It smelled of cordite and rotting meat. I moved like a ghost. My boots found the soft patches of moss by instinct, avoiding the dry leaves that would betray me. For 2 days and 2 nights I hunted. I did not hunt for pelts or meat. I hunted for the drag marks of heavy boots, the snapped branches at shoulder height, the copper tang of blood on the wind. The woods were teeming with German patrols. I watched them pass so close I could see the condensation of their breath. They were looking for the same thing I was, but they were looking with their eyes. I was looking with my blood. I found them in a ravine, huddled under the roots of a fallen oak. They were not a squad anymore. They were a pile of shivering rags and wet bandages. 7 men. 3 could not walk. The silence here was heavy, pressing against my eardrums, but it was shattered by a low, gurgling moan. It was the sergeant. His belly was open, a mess of dark wetness that I could not fix. He was delirious, calling out for water, his voice rising in the quiet dark. I froze, 50 meters away. A flashlight beam cut through the mist. German voices low and sharp. They heard him. I knelt beside the sergeant. He looked at me, his eyes wide and unseeing. Terror and pain fighting for control. He tried to scream. I covered his mouth with my hand. His stubble scratched my palm. The flashlight swept closer. The beam danced over the tree trunks above us. If he screamed, we all died. The 7 men behind me, the wives waiting for them, the children not yet born, all of them would be erased. I pulled the morphine syrette from my kit. It was my last one. It was enough to numb a leg for amputation, or to send a dying man into the deep, final sleep. I looked at the sergeant. I was no longer a medic. I was a trapper finding an animal caught in the iron jaws, suffering. Compassion is not always soft. Sometimes it is the hardest thing a man can hold. I plunged the needle into his thigh and squeezed the tube flat. I held his mouth until his thrashing slowed, until his eyes rolled back, until the tension left his jaw. The moaning stopped. The flashlight beam swept over our heads one last time, then swung away. The boots crunched on the gravel, fading into the distance. I checked for a pulse. It was a flutter, then nothing. I had saved the herd, but I had killed the straggler. I signaled the others to move. We had to go. No, but the forest floor vibrated. Not 1 patrol. 2. They were circling back, tightening the net. We were cut off. To the east, the German machine guns. To the west, the patrol coming back. My eyes darted frantically in the gloom. There, half buried in the side of the ravine, was a concrete drainage pipe. It was narrow, choked with dead leaves and sludge, barely wide enough for a man to crawl. It disappeared into the earth, a black, suffocating throat. My chest seized. In the vast tundra, the sky is the only roof. I had never known walls. The idea of crawling into that stone coffin, with the earth pressing down, with no air, no light, it terrified me more than the German bullets. The boots were louder now. I looked at the men. They were looking at me. They trusted me. I was the pathfinder. I pushed the fear down into my gut, right next to the memory of the sergeant's eyes. I shoved the first man toward the pipe. Go, I whispered. Crawl. I forced them in one by one, pushing the wounded ahead of me. I went last. As I slid into the darkness, the world narrowed to the width of my shoulders. The air was thick with the smell of mold and old water. The walls scraped my sides. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't turn. I could only crawl. Above us, the ground shook. Dust filtered down into my eyes. The Germans were standing right on top of us. I lay in the muck, holding my breath, my heart hammering against the concrete like a trapped bird. I closed my eyes and imagined the snow, the endless white fields of home. I forced my mind out of the pipe, back to the high ridges of the Urals. We crawled for an hour, maybe a lifetime. When I saw the gray light of the riverbank ahead, I wept. Not from sadness, but from the sheer, violent relief of space. We floated the wounded across on logs under the cover of the morning fog. When we reached the Soviet lines, they called me a hero. They gave me vodka and clapped my back. They said I was the ghost of the forest. But that night, sitting by the fire, I could not stop shivering. The crackle of the wood sounded like breaking bones. The darkness beyond the firelight was not empty. It was watching me. I survived the war. I returned to Arkhangelsk, but I never set a trap again. I never walked into the deep woods again. I work in a factory now, under bright lights and loud machines. The noise comforts me. It keeps the silence away. My whole life I was a hunter who believed the wilderness belonged to me. I thought I knew the harvest, but in that war, I learned the truth. The forest does not care if you are the predator or the prey. It only cares that you are meat. A home is not the land you walk on. It is the people you carry back. I lost my forest, but I found my brothers. That is a trade a man can live with. This memory is a shard of glass I carry. Help me pull it out. Subscribe to keep this history alive.